What exactly did you think you were? Some guy who drives a truck for a living, playing family man? Keep an eye on your bag next time. You hear that? Man talks like he's got somewhere important to be. Dad, please, just let it go. Excuse us. Step outside. Let her watch what you're actually worth. Marcus Reed had never understood the gap between fear and respect. Never once in his whole life had he stopped to ask whether they were the same thing. That night, in a roadside diner outside a small Texas town, he thought he had someone figured out at a glance. A tired-looking man in work clothes, sitting across from a girl who clearly wished she were somewhere else. An easy target, or so it seemed. He was wrong about nearly everything that mattered. The man he'd just insulted had spent over 20 years living in conditions where silence wasn't submission, it was a skill. Where holding back wasn't fear, it was something drilled into him in places that never made it into any official file. Marcus had shoved. Jack hadn't shoved back. That quiet was the only caution Marcus was ever going to get, and whether he had the sense to read it was an entirely different matter. If you're new to this channel, we tell stories about people who turn out to be nothing like what you'd assume looking at them. Hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this one ends up. The Peterbilt had logged close to 900,000 miles. Jack Morrison knew every noise it made. The way the engine sounded different in cold rain, the slight drift to the left on a wet highway, the particular groan in the driver's side door he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years and never had, because there was always something more urgent, a school play, a parent-teacher meeting, a birthday he refused to miss. He'd built his entire career around one non-negotiable rule: routes that got him home often, not occasionally, because his daughter was 12, and 12 was the age where simply being there mattered more than anything he could send from a distance. Sarah had died 6 years earlier. He didn't talk about it much, and Emma had learned not to push. What she understood about her father was plainer than what she couldn't name, that he was always up before her, making breakfast without being asked, that he had never once missed something at her school. On the rare morning she found him at the kitchen table, coffee gone cold, staring past the window to nothing in particular, she'd sit next to him, and he always came back to her. What Emma had no real way of understanding was the life her father had lived before she was old enough to ask about it. She knew he'd served in the Navy. She knew it had been a long stretch of years. There was something in the way he paused mid-sentence, in how he clocked a room before choosing a seat, in a stillness that didn't look like ordinary calm. But she was 12, and the world he'd built for her smelled like road coffee and pancakes, and she'd had no reason yet to look past it. It was summer break. He'd brought her along on a shore haul, one delivery out and back, home again by Sunday. She sat by the window with her sketchbook, 2 weeks of careful drawings of birds she'd spotted through the windshield glass. She was midway through telling him about a classmate, Madison, who'd said something unfair during a group project, when the diner door opened and 3 men walked in out of the rain. The tallest one led. He moved like someone used to rooms rearranging themselves around him, conversations dropping in volume, eyes tracking his path, the general atmosphere shifting slightly the moment he walked in. Marcus Reed was 28, 6'2", built in the exact proportions that made his profession obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. 15 wins, 0 losses across 4 years of professional MMA. His gym back in San Antonio had close to 200 members, and his name had started showing up in conversations about real promotional contracts. Behind him came Derek and Tyler, moving with the easy rhythm of men who'd spent enough time in someone else's orbit that they'd stopped questioning where it was heading.
Marcus dropped his gym bag on the counter without checking if there was room for it. It landed wrong, sliding into a coffee mug at the end, tipping it, sending a dark stain spreading across the surface until it reached the table where Jack and Emma sat, catching the corner of Emma's sketchbook before either of them could react. Jack's hand went straight to Emma's arm. He turned her toward him, checked her hands, checked her wrist where the coffee had come closest. She wasn't hurt. He made sure of that before anything else. Only then did he look up at Marcus and, calmly, ask him to be more careful. His daughter's things had gotten hit.
Marcus looked him over. The faded work shirt, the worn boots, the trucker's cap on the seat beside him, and something settled into his face. Not quite contempt, something adjacent to it, the expression of a man who'd already decided this person didn't warrant his full attention. He didn't apologize. Instead, he said something about how people who sit that close to a busy counter should expect accidents. Derek laughed. Tyler was already on his phone. Jack turned back to Emma, asking if the sketchbook was ruined, if she wanted to switch seats. The cover was stained. The pages inside were mostly fine. Emma said she was okay, though she was watching Marcus now with the careful attention of a kid who senses something has shifted but doesn't know how far it's going to go. Marcus was irritated, and it wasn't really about the spilled mug. It was that he'd just been spoken to like a man expected to comply, and then watched the guy turn away without even waiting to see if he would. He wasn't used to being brushed off. He was used to being noticed. The particular gravity that comes with being young, dangerous, and visibly on the rise. The trucker hadn't given him any of that. He'd made his ask and gone back to his daughter like Marcus's reaction wasn't even worth tracking. Marcus stepped closer to the table and made a comment about the clothes. Not the word itself, but the meaning was clear enough. That a man who hauled freight for a living was a certain kind of man. He said it like an observation, the way people do when they want deniability. Emma's hand found her father's arm under the table. Jack set his fork down. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Marcus steadily, the way you look at something you've already sized up and don't need to spend more energy on, and told him he'd asked once to be careful, and that was the only time he'd be asking. Then he pulled out cash for the meal and a tip, stood, put a hand on Emma's shoulder, and walked her toward the door. It was a clean exit, the kind meant to end something before it turned into something worse. Most people faced with that particular brand of stillness, the stillness of someone who's already made a decision and isn't wavering on it, would have let it go, turned back to their food, their friends, the rest of an ordinary night. Marcus wasn't most people. He called after them, loud enough that heads turned across the diner. He said something about the girl, worded so it would land on her directly, designed so that whatever happened next, she'd remember it. Derek's expression changed. Tyler put the phone down. Jack held the door for Emma and stepped out into the rain without answering.
The lot was wet, badly lit, everything washed in dull amber from the overhead lights. The Peterbilt sat at the far end, where there was room for the rig. Emma walked ahead. Jack followed a step behind, rain collecting on his jacket. They were halfway across when Marcus came through the door. It wasn't a fully conscious decision on his part, or if it was, it came from the part of him that had never actually lost, that had walked out of 15 professional fights with his record untouched, that had built his whole identity around being the most dangerous person in any room. Someone simply walking away without acknowledging that felt to him like an attack on something he couldn't quite name. He moved fast, cut around Jack, and planted himself between him and the truck, loud enough for Emma to hear, asking if Jack didn't want his little girl to know what kind of man her father really was. That was the calculation. That was the entire point. Jack stopped walking, not because the words landed anywhere real. He'd been called worse by worse people in places where the stakes were nothing like a parking lot in West Texas. He stopped because Emma was 10 feet behind him, and this man had deliberately dragged her into it, and that changed what the moment required. He turned. He looked at Marcus with the flat, unhurried clarity of someone who'd already taken stock and filed the result away. Quietly, he said his daughter was watching and asked Marcus not to make her witness something they'd both regret. Marcus heard it as fear. He threw a left hook, a real one, full hip rotation, all 210 pounds of trained muscle behind it, the kind of punch that had ended fights. Against most people, it would have been more than enough. Jack wasn't most people. He'd spent over 22 years training in places where the person across from you wasn't trying to win, they were trying to end you, and that distinction rewires the body's reflexes below the level of conscious thought. He read the punch in the split second before it landed, stepped inside the arc instead of retreating, into the dead space where the blow carried no force. What followed wasn't a fight in any real sense. There was no back and forth. Marcus's balance broke before he understood it was breaking. He went down hard, face first onto wet pavement. Jack was behind him instantly, controlling the arm, weight distributed with the settled precision of a task performed so many times it no longer required thought. He had the joint at its limit. One more ounce of pressure in the right direction and the damage would take months to heal, maybe longer. The choice was entirely his. He didn't take it. He said one word: tap. For a moment, everything in Marcus fought it, every reflex from 15 undefeated fights, every piece of identity built over 28 years refusing to accept that this was actually happening. Then his right hand hit the wet pavement. Once. Twice. Jack let go and stood. He didn't look at Derek or Tyler, frozen near the diner's entrance in the stillness of men who just watched something move in a direction they hadn't expected. He walked back to Emma, sketchbook clutched to her chest, rain on her face, eyes trying to reconcile the man on the ground with the father she'd known her entire life. He asked if she was okay. She nodded, wordless, and he walked her the rest of the way to the truck, helped her up into the cab, came around, got in, started the engine. The wipers cleared the glass, and the diner shrank in the mirrors as he pulled on to the access road. Emma sat quietly for a while, sketchbook in her lap. Then she said she hadn't known he could do that. Jack merged onto the interstate, settled into the right lane. The rain thickened. The road ahead ran west into the dark, long and straight. He said he'd learned it a long time ago, and that he hoped she'd have not much reason to think about it. She asked what he meant. He told her that being capable of something and needing to use it were two very different things, and that most of the time, if you handled the first one right, the second one never came up. Emma studied her father's profile, the face she'd known her whole life, hands relaxed on the wheel. The same man who made her breakfast, came to every school play, sat with her at the kitchen table in the early morning light. She didn't say anything else. Somewhere behind them, in a lot off the interstate, Marcus Reed was getting to his feet for the first time in 15 fights, trying to understand exactly what just happened to him and by whom.
The days that followed were some of the worst Marcus had lived through in years, and the shoulder pain was the smallest part of it. Pain he could manage. He'd built his entire career on pushing through it. What he couldn't manage was the image that followed him from the moment he woke until the moment he finally slept. The wet lot, and one word, and his own hand hitting the pavement, his own voice giving the signal that ended it. He'd made that sound 15 times over 4 years of training, always a tactical choice, always in a room he'd walk out of with the meaning dissolving back into ordinary routine. This time it didn't dissolve. It was there every morning he walked into his gym and his members looked at him, and he couldn't quite read what they saw.
Derek and Tyler hadn't told anyone. He'd made sure of that in the first conversation after. They'd agreed fast, which told him they were as rattled as he was. But agreement wasn't the same as forgetting, and people who witness something they weren't supposed to see carry the knowledge in the room with them, whether they say it out loud or not. He could see it. The half-second Derek held eye contact too briefly now, the way Tyler filled silence at the gym with noise that hadn't been necessary before. Marcus started rebuilding the story that same night, lying in bed, shoulder packed in ice, going through it piece by piece, looking for where the math had broken down. He was 28, trained every day, undefeated, 210 pounds, built specifically for competition. Jack Morrison was 49, drove freight, wore a work shirt and road boots, had a 12-year-old who drew birds in a sketchbook. By every rule Marcus understood, that lot should have gone one way. It hadn't, which meant one of three things. His read on Jack was wrong, the conditions were wrong, wet pavement, a bad angle, surprise, or Jack had gotten lucky. He spent most of a week settling, mostly by stubbornness rather than logic, on the second and third options. He had contacts in the regional freight world, people who moved between trucking and the fight scene through shared gyms and overlapping circles. Through two of them, he found what he needed: Jack Morrison, independent owner-operator, one Peterbilt, regional routes through West Texas. The record was clean, ordinary, and explained nothing about that parking lot. His next delivery was scheduled for the following week, a steel plant on the edge of the industrial district, arrival around 1 a.m. Derek pushed back when Marcus laid it out, not loudly, that wasn't his style, but plainly, saying the diner had been one thing and this was something else entirely, and he wanted that on record before they went further. Tyler sat with his elbows on his knees and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Marcus told them it wasn't going to be a fight, he just needed to see the guy again, on dry ground, without a parking lot working against him. He said it with the conviction of someone who'd already finished the argument in his own head and was now just performing it for an audience. Neither of them fully believed it wouldn't turn into something worse, but neither found the words to stop it either. By then, Marcus's certainty had been carrying all three of them long enough that breaking away took a kind of resistance they hadn't practiced. Jack dropped Emma at her aunt's 2 days after the drive home, a clear, warm Sunday evening. She hugged him at the door with the thoroughness of a 12-year-old who'd decided something without putting words to it. Just before he turned back to the truck, she asked if the man from the diner would come looking for him. Jack told her no. Said it with a smile that was entirely convincing. Then he sat behind the wheel a while before starting the engine. He'd known men like Marcus before, not that exact man, but that shape of person, that architecture of ego and physical ability that produces that kind of behavior in a parking lot. He knew how rarely it resolved quietly. The weight of that knowledge had nothing to do with fear for himself. It had everything to do with the fact that his daughter was no longer in the truck, and this was the first time since Sunday he'd let himself really think about what was probably coming.
The steel plant sat among low industrial buildings on the west side of the city, ringed by chain link and open yard. At 1 a.m., the district was empty in the specific way industrial zones go empty at that hour. Not dark, exactly, just still. Security lamps throwing amber light over nothing that moved. Jack came in on the access road, rig idling steady, paperwork organized on the passenger seat, window cracked to the night air. He'd made this run before, knew the receiving bay, knew roughly how long the offload took and when he'd be back on the highway. Headlights swung out of a gap between two buildings and cut across the road ahead of him, a Ford Raptor. Jack braked with the steadiness of a man who wasn't surprised because on some level he'd been expecting this version of this since Sunday. He stopped the truck, stepped down from the cab. Marcus was already out of the Raptor, walking around the front without hurrying. Derek and Tyler came out the passenger side, and in the flat industrial light, Jack could see what they were carrying. Heavy aluminum flashlights, long enough to do real damage in a swing. This wasn't the diner lot anymore. This had been planned. Someone had found his route, his schedule, his destination. Whatever Marcus had let himself become was no longer something you could explain away as a bad night and a short fuse. Marcus said it loud, out in the open. No rain this time, no wet pavement, 3 against 1, no little girl watching. He said it like a man presenting proof that a mistake was about to be corrected. Jack took off his cap and set it on the truck's step. He'd made a choice at the diner about the kind of man he wanted to be for his daughter, and it had been the right choice, and he didn't regret it. But the situation had changed completely. Emma was safe at her aunt's. These 3 had planned, traveled, and shown up armed and with intent. Whatever obligation he had to model restraint for a watching 12-year-old, he'd already met it. What was left was simpler. The tiredness left his face. What replaced it wasn't aggression, just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and having done it so many times the mechanics no longer need conscious thought. Tyler moved first, mostly because he wanted Marcus to see him commit, so he committed early, without the discipline real commitment requires. He swung the flashlight in a wide arc at Jack's head, plenty of force behind it, but the arc was wide, leaving a brief opening only someone trained to see it would recognize. Jack didn't step back, he stepped forward and inside, the counterintuitive move, the one Tyler had no answer for, because nothing in his experience had prepared him for someone who treats an incoming swing as an invitation to close distance. The flashlight came loose from his grip. A short, controlled motion took Tyler's balance past the point of recovery. Jack guided him down, guided, not drove, the way someone does when they've already decided the outcome. Tyler went to his knees, then his side, and stayed there. Not unconscious, just aware enough to know the man standing over him had chosen not to do more, and moving might change that choice. Derek watched it happen from 8 feet away, second flashlight hanging at his side. He looked at Tyler on the ground, looked at Jack, and something that had been quietly objecting in him for a week finally surfaced. He set the flashlight down, said he was done, 2 words, almost conversational, looked at Marcus with an expression that wasn't apology and wasn't accusation, just blunt honesty finally forced out of him, said he hadn't signed up for whatever this actually was, and backed up until he was sitting against the Raptor's wheel well. Marcus stood alone. He'd come here with a theory that the lot was weather and bad luck and an angle he hadn't planned for, and that on dry ground, under clear conditions, the math would correct itself. Instead, what happened was worse than losing. Jack didn't fight him like a fighter fights. He absorbed and redirected, moved with Marcus's force instead of against it, turned every committed attack into a matter of geometry and weight. When Marcus grabbed for a clinch against the side of the truck, Jack let him have it, then rotated, and suddenly Marcus's right arm was pinned behind him at an angle his own body was fighting against. The lock was total. Jack held it at the threshold, enough pressure to make the limit fully felt, not enough to decide on real damage. That was a conscious choice, made in the same fraction of a second it had been available, the same choice he'd made in the diner lot. He'd already decided the outcome he wanted. Marcus's destruction wasn't part of it. What Jack couldn't completely control was what happened next. Marcus's own competitive nervous system, 15 fights worth of reflex firing before his rational mind could catch up. He wrenched, not a tactical move, just a raw pull from something in him that couldn't process the existence of the lock. The tendons in his right hand gave way under the torque of his own resistance. Jack felt it happen and released instantly, but the damage was already done, caused entirely by Marcus's own attempt to escape something that had no escape. Marcus dropped to one knee, gripping the hand to his chest, color draining from his face for reasons that had nothing to do with stubbornness. Jack stood in the amber light, breathing normally, nothing about him marking the moment. Then the sirens came. 3 patrol cars swung into the access road, lights cutting through the dark, and in the headlights the scene laid itself out. Tyler on the ground, Derek against the wheel well, Marcus kneeling with his ruined hand, and Jack standing beside the truck without a mark on him. Marcus looked up into the lights and made his calculation fast. He said loud and clear that Jack had attacked them, decided that if he couldn't win the physical fight, he'd shifted to a story where the numbers favored him, where the optics of one older trucker against 3 younger athletes might carry him through. Officers fanned out, weapons drawn, giving orders. Jack raised his hands and complied without hesitation, without variation, the compliance of someone who knew the protocol and had no anxiety about the process. One patrol car arrived last. The man who stepped out of it moved differently from the others, older, walking with the unhurried authority of someone whose rank had been settled long enough that he'd stopped performing it. Captain Frank Doyle crossed the yard at his own pace. When he got close enough to see who was standing with his hands raised beside the Peterbilt, he stopped. He lowered his weapon, straightened, brought his right hand up into a formal, clean salute, and said a name with the weight of someone who'd once served under it and never fully stopped. "Commander Morrison." Jack looked at him for a moment, something close to a faint smile crossing his face. "Driving trucks now, Frank?" Doyle held the salute another beat, then let it go and turned to Marcus with an expression that had rearranged into something far more official than it had started as. Marcus stared at Jack, still trying to resolve what he was hearing. Every detail he'd compiled, the faded shirt, the road boots, the ordinary freight route, was still true, and none of it explained this. Doyle told Marcus, without elaboration, that the man he'd tracked to an industrial lot in the middle of the night had spent more than 20 years in special operations, the last stretch of it commanding an elite Navy SEAL unit. He said it not for Marcus's benefit, but because it was relevant to figuring out what had happened and why. Marcus said he didn't care who he used to be, said it loudly with the last scraps of certainty he'd walked in with. Jack walked to the front of the truck without responding and pointed at the dashcam housing. Doyle looked at it, looked at Jack, looked back at Marcus, and Marcus's expression shifted as he followed the logic to its end, understanding even before anyone pulled the footage exactly what a dashcam on an owner-operator's rig was built to capture and how long it had been rolling. The camera had been running since before the Raptor came out of the dark. It had all of it, the truck blocking the road, 3 men stepping out with flashlights, Tyler laying out exactly what he'd come to do. Nothing ambiguous about the sequence. The officers went through their process. Tyler was sat up and checked over. Derek answered every question in full. The Raptor's keys were bagged as evidence. Marcus's wrists came together behind his back, cuffs going on, standing there in the industrial light with his ruined hand and his undefeated record, every plan from the past week now fully spent. Jack wasn't looking at any of it. He turned to Doyle and asked, in the same tone he might use to check the weather report, whether the delivery could still be got offloaded before morning. Doyle said he thought they could make that work. Marcus heard the question and went still. The man he'd spent a week reorganizing his entire life around confronting had just asked as his first concern about a freight delivery. The sheer smallness of it, the complete absence of any sense that Marcus, or this night, or any of it had registered as significant, did more damage than the physical outcome ever could have, because it made one thing undeniable. Jack had looked at him in the diner, in the parking lot, and here in this yard at 1 in the morning, and arrived at the exact same conclusion every time.
Not a rival, not a threat worth real attention, just a problem to manage on the way to somewhere else. 4 months after the steelyard, the surgeon delivered the news carefully and without drama, the way surgeons do when what they're saying isn't an emergency, but a permanent redrawing of someone's future. The tendon damage in Marcus's right hand was significant. The repair had gone about as well as it could. Return to competition at his old level was unlikely. He used the word unlikely with the deliberate softness of someone who'd learned that impossible triggers a different, harder kind of grief. Marcus sat there with his hand wrapped and understood in a way that went past simple comprehension that 15-0 was the final number. There wouldn't be a 16th fight. The record he'd built his whole identity on had closed out while he was on his knees in an industrial lot with a man standing over him already thinking about a delivery schedule. The sponsors went first. 2 calls in the same week, both using almost identical language, careful, diplomatic, expressing continued personal respect while making it clear the partnership was over. The third sponsor didn't call. They sent a letter through their legal department, shorter and somehow worse for its brevity. Gym membership had been dropping since the story worked its way through the regional fight community, which it had, fast, because it had all the ingredients stories need to travel. An undefeated record, a truck stop diner, a rainy parking lot, a man who asked for a tap and got one. Nobody needed to embellish anything. The facts were already built for it. Derek came by the gym once, a few weeks later, sat across from Marcus in the small back office, and said what he'd come to say, that he was sorry for his part in getting them out to that industrial lot, that he was heading to his brother's place in Dallas for a while to train somewhere new. He wasn't apologizing for leaving, only for the choices that got them there. Marcus told him he understood, meant it too, which surprised him a little. Tyler never came by. Marcus understood that too. Jack could have made things much worse legally. His attorney had made that clear from the first conversation. The dash cam footage left nothing in doubt. A cooperative witness was ready to testify, and the charges could have been pushed much further, closing off Marcus's freedom for a real stretch of time. Jack chose not to go that route. Through his lawyer, he said he was satisfied with Marcus taking full accountability and with the civil settlement that followed. When Doyle had asked him at the scene why he was inclined toward restraint given everything, Jack told him he had a daughter learning how adults behave by watching him, and he didn't want to teach her that justice and punishment were the same thing. That answer sat underneath everything that came after. Emma hadn't made Jack softer. She'd made him more deliberate about when force was actually necessary, about what restraint communicated, about the line between power used for its own satisfaction and power used because a situation genuinely demanded it. He'd spent over 20 years in work that required the first kind of precision. Coming home to a daughter who was watching had simply given that precision somewhere new to live.
6 months after the steelyard, Marcus was still running what was left of the gym. He'd sold the main floor and 3 of 4 equipment rooms to cover legal fees and the settlement. What he kept was the back room, a padded space, a heavy bag, a small mat area, which he started opening for free to teenagers from the lower-income neighborhoods north of the highway. It hadn't started as a program with a name or a plan. It started because he needed to be in the gym to feel like himself, and having people around made the silence easier to sit with, and nobody questioned a guy offering free lessons in exchange for company. Tyrell showed up on a Tuesday during the 3rd week of it, 14, big for his age, not trained muscle, just the loose, unclaimed size of a kid who'd grown fast and hadn't figured out what to do with the physical weight it gave him. He stood outside the door nearly 10 minutes before coming in.
When Marcus asked who'd told him about the sessions, Tyrell said a cousin mentioned it and shrugged in a way that closed the subject. Marcus let him train, didn't ask for anything else. 3 weeks in, on a Wednesday, Marcus was working a grappling sequence with 2 other boys when he heard the noise shift from the far corner of the mat. Tyrell was standing over a smaller kid, 13, slight, who'd been coming for 2 weeks, shoulders squared, chin up, voice pitched low in a register that didn't need volume because the size difference did the work on its own. He wasn't hitting him. He was doing exactly what Marcus had done in diners and parking lots and 100 ordinary rooms, using his own physical presence to compress the space around someone smaller until the pressure did the talking. Marcus crossed the mat and told Tyrell to step outside with him. In the narrow hallway between the mat room and the back exit, he looked at the kid a long moment before saying anything. The question that came out wasn't the one he'd planned. He'd crossed that mat meaning to lay down a rule, a consequence, a line. What came out instead was something he hadn't prepared. He asked Tyrell whether he wanted people to be afraid of him or whether he wanted them to trust him. Tyrell looked at him with the specific expression of a teenager who's just been asked a question that doesn't fit the conversation he expected, and didn't answer. Marcus told him to think about it before next Tuesday. That evening, Marcus sat in his car in his apartment lot for a long time. The question he'd asked Tyrell wasn't one he'd invented. It was something he'd arrived at slowly, over 6 months of recovery and legal proceedings and shrinking bank statements, by reconstructing what Jack Morrison had actually been doing in that parking lot off the interstate when he chose to walk away from a man openly mocking him in front of his kid. Jack hadn't been afraid. Marcus understood that now with a clarity that hadn't been available to him in the moment, and never would have been without everything that followed. Jack had made a specific, deliberate call about what he wanted his daughter to see, made it in real time, under direct provocation, and held to it even after the provocation turned physical. That wasn't weakness. That was a level of discipline Marcus's entire framework for strength had never had a category for. He thought about Tyrell standing over the smaller kid. He thought about himself standing over tables in diners. He thought about Derek's face in the weeks after the lot, respect curdling into something else, something that had never actually been better than what he'd had before, even though it had felt like the thing worth chasing. He sat in that lot until it got dark. Then he called a guy who knew the freight routes through West Texas.
He found Jack at a diner outside San Angelo 2 weeks later, a Thursday evening. Different diner, same bones, linoleum floor, yellow light, heavy mugs, the particular quiet of a place built for people passing through rather than arriving. Jack was in a corner booth, back to the wall, Cap on the seat beside him, a plate he'd barely touched. He looked up when Marcus came through the door, and the read that moved across his face was quick and complete. His hands didn't move from the table. Marcus stopped a few feet off and raised both hands, left flat, right open, showing the surgical scar along the base of the palm and the slight irregularity in how the fingers sat now. He said he wasn't there to fight, said it plainly, no performance in it. Then he stood there and let Jack decide. Jack studied him a long moment, then nodded once toward the seat across the table. Marcus sat. He put his right hand flat on the table where it could be seen, looked at the scar, at the grip that the physical therapist said was probably permanent, then looked up and said he'd come to say thank you. Jack's expression didn't shift much, but something in it recalibrated, like he'd prepared for a few different versions of this conversation and needed a different one now. Marcus told him what the last few months had actually looked like from the inside, careful not to frame it as a bid for sympathy, just information. He said he'd spent years treating the belt and the record as proof of his worth as a person, and the problem with that was it had no ceiling. If the belt and the record were what made him valuable, then anything that threatened them threatened everything.
which was why a spilled coffee mug in a diner had felt like something requiring a response, why losing in a parking lot had felt like something requiring correction, why he'd driven out to an industrial yard with 2 friends and a pair of aluminum flashlights to find a man who'd never wanted anything from him except to be left alone. He said if he'd gone out there and found someone carrying a gun instead of someone trained 20 years in places where guns were standard, he'd probably be dead. He said if he'd kept going the way he was going, he'd eventually have done real damage to someone with far less control over the outcome than Jack had, and the result of that wouldn't have been a scar on his hand. Jack listened to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus finished, the quiet between them wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that comes from someone taking in the real version of a thing and deciding how to answer it. Marcus asked why that first night in the diner, Jack had let him talk like that in front of Emma, in front of everyone, when he clearly could have ended it a different way. Jack said it was because Emma was there, said it plainly, no dressing it up. Said his daughter wasn't going to remember a number, not the years he'd served, not the missions, not the fights he'd won or the ones he'd walked away from. She was going to remember how he behaved when someone pushed him, because that's what kids actually carry forward from the adults they watch growing up. He said a man who can only show restraint when nobody's provoking him hasn't really learned restraint at all. The diner had been a chance to show her what it looked like to get pushed and still choose, and he'd taken it. Marcus said the black belt had taught him to break someone, said it plainly, no self-pity in it, just a fact about what the training had produced. Jack told him maybe what came next was learning how to build one instead. Said it in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything, not performing wisdom, just reporting what he'd found to be true.
The free program had been running 2 months when Jack and Emma stopped by on a Saturday afternoon in November. Marcus hadn't arranged it, hadn't expected it. They were passing through on a short run, and Jack had remembered the address from something Doyle had mentioned. Emma came through the door behind her father and stopped when she saw Marcus across the mat, crouched next to a boy who'd just been taken down hard and was working out whether he wanted to get back up. Marcus was saying something to him, low. He looked up when the door opened and saw them. Emma moved a little closer to her father's side. Marcus crossed the mat and stopped a reasonable distance away. He looked at Emma and didn't try to make her comfortable with him, didn't explain himself or frame what she was seeing. He told her, quietly and directly, that her father had taught him something he'd needed to learn for a long time. Then he looked at Jack. Jack put his hand out. Marcus took it with his right hand, the scarred one, the one with the reduced grip, and they held the shake a moment. It wasn't a contest, it wasn't 2 men measuring each other, it was something quieter and more significant than that. 2 people recognizing that something had run its full course and landed somewhere real. Walking back to the truck, Emma asked her father whether he could have beaten Marcus right from the very start, the first moment in that parking lot. Jack unlocked the passenger door, held it for her, said he probably could have. She climbed up into the seat, looked down at him and asked him why he hadn't. He told her it was because she was watching. She sat with that for a moment while he came around and got in and started the engine. The Peterbilt pulled out, found the on-ramp, settled into the right lane heading north, steady and unhurried, eating the miles at its own pace. Emma had her sketchbook in her lap, the same one from that summer, the cover still faintly stained from a spilled coffee she'd never once complained about. She didn't open it. She looked out at the flat Texas landscape sliding by and thought about what her father had said. She'd never know, then or later, the full weight of what he'd done in the years before she was old enough to ask, the operations, the places, the people who'd served under him, everything those years had cost him. Jack didn't need her to know any of that. What he wanted her to carry was simpler and more lasting than a record of what he survived. The understanding that the strongest person in a room isn't always the loudest, or the most aggressive, or the one who leaves the most damage behind on the way out. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who looks at everything they're capable of and chooses deliberately, without apology, to be something better than that capability alone would ever make them. The highway ran on ahead of them, long and straight, northwest into the late afternoon light. Jack drove. Emma drew. The truck held its lane and covered its miles the way it always had, the way it would for as long as there were routes left to run, and a daughter who still sometimes wanted to ride along. If this one stuck with you, you're probably someone who thinks a lot about what real strength actually looks like. We've got more stories just like it here on Rebuilt Stories. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.